Yeah, and it's on e-learning. The discussion that can go on there is important to have a space in which we can talk about the course. But I'm going to leave that now, get out of that e-learning presentation and present the PowerPoint. Welcome. We're starting. This is lecture number 5 of Sociology of Popular Culture. Lecture number 5 is on cinematic revisionism. We're going to be looking at Partition, the film of Gurinder Chaddha, Viceroy's House. So it's a focus on India and on a particular period in history, but very much often interpreted, reinterpreted, a part of history that's been material for a huge number of films in the film tradition of Bollywood and Tollywood and the other film traditions within India, and indeed in diasporic film. In particular, actually, diasporic film today, because we're going to be looking at Viceroy's House by Gurinder Chaddha, and a close reading of Viceroy's House. The focus, or the preparatory reading, if you couldn't watch the whole film, although I'd hope somebody might have, is Fatima Bhutto's essay in the Guardian newspaper from a while back now. The article, see if this link will work. No, I can't grab it. It's a drag. The article which Gurinder Chaddha found very upsetting herself, but Fatima Bhutto had watched Viceroy's House and called it a servile pantomime, and wept. Right? Why? I mean, this is a commentary article in a newspaper. So it's not like an academic study, but nonetheless, it's to be taken very seriously. And so, of course, is the filmmaker's response. And the fact that she got to respond in The Guardian as well is interesting. Her response: my film has been willfully misrepresented as anti-Muslim. So that's where we're starting. I suppose talking about ethnicity now. Just think of that headline. I watched this servile pantomime and wept. Now, I've written a whole book called Pantomime Terror, and although I came up with the topic separately, also there's a fantastic book Gargi Bhattacharya's book on the dangers of brown men addressed a similar scope to look at the war on terror. But her other work, she takes up the story of Scheherazade as well from pantomime. Well, Scheherazade is from the 1001 Nights, but it's often the stories of 1001 Nights are used for pantomime. So in a way, this Fatima Bhutto's article uses the metaphor of pantomime to suggest that this is like a fable or a myth, Gurinder Chaddha's film, about the partition. You know, and that's really interesting because it's a way into the critiques of the Frankfurt School again, right? Adorno and Walter Benjamin, because by accessing pantomime and by extension the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights, you also tag Scheherazade, the figure of Scheherazade, the storyteller, with the political intent. And that's what's really great about the Benjamin essay, The Storyteller. To try and get into this, I want to suggest that we're in the world of colonial dress-ups for TV. You can think of a Vietnamese version of that. If you think of the films like Indochine with Catherine Deneuve or indeed the French section of Apocalypse Now, the Redux, when they edited that back in, Francis Ford Coppola's edit, or many films, even parts of Spike Lee's recent couple of years ago now film on Vietnam. But I'm focusing on India, and the India of partition, which is now 70 years ago, right? 1947. Is a trauma in Indian history, but now long back, is continually returned to in popular filmmaking as like a story for interpretation. So in the book Pantomime Terror, and I talk about Walter Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, because in that essay, The Storyteller, he talks about how storytelling is kind of dying out, he writes, and he's writing after World War I. He's complaining that Walter Benjamin is complaining that people have been unable to really talk about the war, the trauma of the war, how horrible it was. They haven't found a way to talk about it. There's kind of a silence about it. At a time when there's so much talk, so many stories being told, it's interesting that there have been a kind of a loss of ability. There was a kind of silence. I think that silence is over, long over. And so that period when there was the story of the war was fresh. People were unable to really bear any witness to it. It was just too traumatic. And maybe in some sense, partition for India at first was so. And the way in which it was discussed is then made people maybe careful about how they told stories about it. I mean, we did discuss last week the film Mela, the first one, the 1947 version, really does kind of talk about partition without mentioning it explicitly. Yeah, but it's still about it. So audiences would have made the connection. In Walter Benjamin's essay, The Storyteller, though, he's talking about the power of stories and references, 3 times he references the figure of Scheherazade from the Arabian 1001 Nights. Now, I don't know if you know the 1001 Nights well, or the backstory to that. Basically, there's a king whose wife, I believe, I may have got it slightly wrong because of memory issues, wife betrays him with the butcher, I think, and he becomes completely jaundiced, and he's a monster, really. He then takes a new woman from the town every night, has his way with her, and then has her executed in the morning so she'll never betray him. And the Grand Vizier, his assistant, is providing these women going through the town, and after like 3,000 or so, they're running out of young women who will fit the role. Grotesque, really. But the Grand Vizier then has to really give up his own daughters one by one. The elder of the 2 daughters, there's Scheherazade and Dunya, I forget. Scheherazade kind of volunteers. The Grand Vizier wants her to flee and doesn't want to. She says, "No, I've got to do this," and she has a strategy. Basically, and you'll know the story if you know it. She starts telling the king the story. I mean, they have their do the business. They have their do the nuptials. Then she starts telling the king a story afterwards. Her sister is there as well, listening to the story. I don't know. That's weird. But she starts telling the story, and it lasts all night. And it's a really engaging story and interesting. It's like Sinbad the Sailor or some adventures of some culture heroes. These are stories that we know and have had handed down. They were translated quite early on into French and English, Lane translation, and then Richard Burton, famously, the East India captain and then vice consul based in Trieste. Okay, no problem. He does a translation, a great translation in like 12 volumes or something, and 10 volumes of supplements, extra versions of the stories. And it's really powerful stuff. 1001 Nights. Anyway, Scheherazade is there telling the king the story, and so as to not get to the end of the evening, basically, and or not to be killed in the morning, she doesn't quite complete the story, and the king has to go off and do kingly things, right? In the morning, he's got to go and, I don't know, officiate at the treasury or do some bureaucracy. And so instead of having her killed, he wants her to come back the next night and finish the story. And she's smart enough to then like finish the story, but segue into another story after they've done their business, and not complete that story that night. And this goes on for 1001 nights. Every night she's telling a story and she doesn't complete it, so she has to come back the next night. So she doesn't get killed. And after 1001 nights, she's like proved, and the king's fallen in love with her. And although don't read Edgar Allan Poe's 1002nd Night story, because that doesn't end well. But in the 1001 Nights, famously, there are all these stories, and nearly all it's like the Aesop's fables of storytelling. It's a compendium. Most cultures have these compendiums of all stories. So it contains all the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, and as I said, Sinbad, and I think even like a version of Cinderella and or Snow White or something like that. This is material, Sinbad and Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and so on, is material for pantomime performance, which is a theatre form that belongs to the 18th century, well, begins in the 18th century. Well, where does it begin? It reaches back to Commedia dell'arte in Italy. It's a popular entertainment form. Like, it's not high culture like opera, it's mass culture. The popular classes watch it. It's fun and bawdy. There's sexual jokes. There's always a madam who's a man dressed as a woman, who kind of is like the chorus or the narrator, and there's a best boy and a best girl, and there's always, often it happens just before Christmas, and harlequins. There are some regular characters, and they all do a story, some well-known story, Jack and the Beanstalk, things like that, and it's called panto, so it's a bit pantomime, slapstick. Like, famously, we talk about a pantomime horse. A pantomime horse is two people dressed in a horse costume, and it's really obviously just a horse, but it's really funny. Okay, and pantomime is that, and because it's funny, because it's comedy, it can also be really serious. Like, they can mock power, mock the political figures, like with sexual innuendo, with double entendre, double meanings, and by including politicians from today in stories from back then, like I don't know, where the demon actually turns out to be the prime minister or someone like that, something like that. You can make fun, and all sorts of characters have appeared in the Christmas pantomime theatre. The kids go to it, but adults also laugh because, the bad guy is. I remember one about. I took my son to see it, my oldest son, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe. Not 15, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe 10. And it was Saddam Hussein was one of the characters. Nothing was made of it, but he was just called Saddam because he was the bad guy, right? The former leader of Iraq who was hunted down and discovered hiding in a hole by the US forces. Right? And Osama bin Laden's been, maybe that's a bit touchy. You wouldn't go too far with pantomime, but pantomime is this popular form anyway for telling stories for kids that adults also laugh at, especially when they have little digs into the politics of the day, which is something, right? So Walter Benjamin's story talks about Scheherazade as this great political storyteller, because she is using the story form to save the lives of future women in the kingdom, basically sacrificing herself to save them and save herself. And then there's the other side of pantomime that has this tradition. There are famous clowns and there are famous characters that of kind of slapstick popular theatre. And I guess it went into film with figures like Charlie Chaplin. He's almost like a pantomime figure when he does the tramp and has his funny walk and his cane, and he's dressing up, a dress up that's itself funny, and yet it's always political, right? Because he's talking about depression era, poverty, and always the struggling little man against the odds and so on. Now, we need some other concepts to think about this today. The way in which mythologies are updated for contemporary dilemmas and political questions. That's certainly the case of what happens with pantomime, but it also happens in so many films. And then the concepts of Orientalism and Exoticism. Orientalism nearly always refers to a book by Edward Said that came out in 1978. But Edward Said's critique, is great, but the critique is more famous than the book. I think not that many people read the book, and if they do, they find the book is really quite hard going. It's a literature, analytical book in literature, and not as famous as the concept of Orientalism, which is an argument that goes something like European scholars writing about the Orient have done two things. They've found the Orient as more fantastic and beautiful and wonderful than it really is, and more demonic and primitive and or despotic. So you think of the Orientalism would be there in Star Wars when Jabba the Hutt is this monster living in a cave on Tatooine planet, and he's got Princess Leia has been kidnapped and forced to dress in chains as a beautiful dancing girl. So you've got both the beautiful, the dancing girl and her shape and her dance and all that, and yet the despotic Arab who's eating snacks, live snacks, and is like slobbery and fat. And has slaves, and is like the Arabic despotic leader, and the beautiful exotic dancer girl, right? And that world is the Orient, unlike the buttoned up and sophisticated and whatever Europe, right? And Said's argument is that the scholars that wrote about the literature of Asia projected onto that literature these categories. that they sought out this form of the Orientalist rendering of Asia was to render it in these, according to this binary, there's these two poles. And exoticism is very similar. The Oriental is usually the demonic, the despotic leader, the lazy, indulgent, slave-owning, pleasure-seeking, monstrous leader who will, be ruthless as well as cold, and yet be all about pleasure. And the exotic is the exotic dancing girl, or the exotic can be everything that's, fantastically wonderful about the East, even though it doesn't really exist, like the perfect beach, or the being in rhapsody about the food, or the exoticism is to celebrate the East or the Orient for what it is in a fantastical imagination of Europe as a contrast. Right? And of course, then there are those who followed Orientalism and made this critique of how racist that was, and so on and so on. And then others that said, actually, members of the Orientals themselves orientalized themselves. They made themselves seem more exotic to get attention, and so on. So there's self-orientalization and so on in the huge literature that followed in the wake of Said's book. I mean, basically, Said was able to take all those scholars that were translating the great works like 1001 Nights and all the other tales from the East, and criticize them for doing that work, and release a whole lot of new studies of that work that showed how they were constructing the East in ways that, well, there was like a strong argument and a soft argument, according to Bobby Said, a friend of mine who did this work called The Fundamental Fear. The strong version of Said is that this Orient that they talked about, it's completely a fantasy. In fact, they constructed the Orient, and the Orient then lived up to it. Right? That the despotic leader didn't exist. They just interpreted things that were going on in that way and made it exist. And the strong version of that argument is they create the Orient. The other one is the softer version is that exists already, but they've overemphasized some things. They've described what's going on, a complex reality that has a whole spectrum of different aspects and dimensions to it. They've only picked out the parts that serve the representation of despotic East or exotic East. And the rest of the normal East, or the Orient, right, as opposed to the Occident. The sun rises in the Orient, it sets in the West. So the end of the day, all of those metaphors of progress and development and being older and superior are kind of built in to this attitude. Right. Now, to have called then Gurinder Chaddha's film Viceroy House where's it gone? A servile pantomime is something like the critique of the Orientalists. Servile, it's too much about the hierarchy and focused on the servants of the Raj, of the English in India, the British establishment, the occupying army, occupying force, and the angle into it by the film is through the perspective of Alia and Jeet, who are basically new servants in the house of the Viceroy, the then leader of the occupying empire, the English in India, and pantomime because basically it's the film is lavish in its interest in dress up. In fact, I should probably show a little bit of the film for starters. Let me try and do that. And I know that that will probably mean that the recording that I put online will get vetoed for royalties reasons. But so it goes. All right, if I click this open with, I'll turn my sound off a bit. We'll just watch a little bit at the start. I'll flick around a little bit. And then I'll come back to you. Well, of course, I'm having trouble getting the thing to play. So let me chat while I try and sort this out. I'm pressing the right things. It's just not doing what I want it to do. So I'm trying a different path now. All right, name matches Viceroy, and searching out my movie version. All right, this is open with this one. Okay, no, that's not good. Size will do. So I have crikey. All right, here we go. And this might be it might cause some feedback as well. I hope not. If I'll click to stop it. No, that's my PowerPoint. All right, I don't seem to have a copy of it. So the alternative, maybe if we just watch the promo, that'll give us an idea of this sumptuousness. I want to convey, if we watch the trailer, well, we've got sections of it. We can watch a couple of minutes of it. If we watch the trailer, you get an idea of how sumptuous it is. So I'll do that. So I'm clicking off again.
I am to be the last Viceroy of India, and I shall carry out the role with great pride.
You're giving a nation back to its people. How bad can it be?
You're in the future.
We are.
Then let's not make a mess of it.
Jeet Kumar, sir. He's the new boy.
We have something in common there.
You think India is ready to rule itself?
We've learned from the best.
From now on, there'll be more Indians of all faiths round our table. We can change a lot, and we absolutely have to.
You'll wear yourself out.
I mean, I'll wear you out.
300 million Hindus and Sikhs want a united India. 100 million Muslims do not.
You dance with your own kind.
My own kind.
Have some respect.
New nations are rarely born in peace.
It's got to be a clean cut. It's a bloody axe cleaving right through people's lives.
Well, whatever their differences are, all Indians have one thing in common.
What's that?
They can't wait to get rid of us.
Your father taught me the future is what we make it.
We are brothers with one soul. To divide us on religious grounds is against the will of God.
Without peace, all other dreams vanish and are reduced to ashes.
India is a ship on fire.
I don't know what to do.
We belong together.
You have used me and my family.
We came to give India back her freedom, not to tear her apart.
So aside from the music, which I'll now turn down, the vision is pretty sumptuous. The music itself is worth a whole commentary. You know, we have all the bits that I wanted to show from the film are here in the clip. What the story is, I'm hoping that shows up. Yeah, is basically the last Viceroy, Mountbatten, is coming to facilitate the sudden-ish handover of India to Indians, right? The British have finally accepted Gandhi's demand that they quit India, and the government's decided to do it as fast as possible after the war. It was part of the deal, I suppose, that happened in negotiations over the war. So Gandhi and the independence movement had pushed for independence in 1942 during the war. Previously, there had been support for the war, British war effort against the Nazis and so on. But then, because there was no agreement that Britain would leave, Gandhi and the Congress had not actively supported the war. And they supported it in some ways. But there was also Netaji Subhas Bose, who had gone over to the other side and sought the support of the Nazis and the Japanese against England, and in fact led a Indian army made up of those that had been captured by Japan in Singapore. British Army Indian soldiers, Sikhs mostly, who were in Singapore, were then freed if they would fight against the English all through Burma. And the Burma campaign was exactly that. Eventually, the English and the Indian Army, well, the English and its Indian troops pushed back the Indian Army in Burma. Lack of support from the Japanese and all sorts of complications. And there are films about that as well, of course. But in this one, the Raj is giving up, basically. They're ending their colonial occupation. And this cousin of the king has been sent out, Mountbatten. He's like a member of the royal household, but not the immediate ruling family, has been sent out to be the last viceroy and to administer the end. And of course, lives in this sumptuous house that we see in this building as we're going up past what is now the National Library and the National Art Gallery in Rajpath, which is a part of Delhi, the capital of Delhi. Moved from Calcutta in 1911 to undermine the independence movement, basically. The Bengalis were really strong on independence and fighting the British, who had made Calcutta the capital of British India. And so the British simply moved their capital to Delhi and then built this amazing area, this Rajpath and Parliament building by a guy called Lutyens, the architect, where they kind of tried to build a better Taj Mahal by building this parliamentary palace and the galleries and the road that led up to it. And the Viceroy's house is this sumptuous building. And we see inside the building very soon in the film and in the promo. Let me just move it along a little bit. Mountbatten is arriving in his full military uniform, like a white savior type role, obviously. He's a naval soldier, and he's coming to this fantastic, what's called Viceroy's house. And Gurinder Chaddha, the filmmaker, and you know from the credits, she's the one who made Bend It Like Beckham. Where does it say? Can't get it still on that. Still from the makers of Bend It Like Beckham, an exclusive. Yeah, I'm not getting it. From the director of Bend It Like Beckham, but she's also made other films like I'm British But, which is really great. And anyway, they get into the Parliament House very early on, and we see them walk in to meet their cast of servants. All the Indians that work in the Viceroy's house are aligned in this central hall looking at them arrive, the arrival hall, some sort of monumental architecture there. They're turning up, and all the staff who will, from the kitchen to dressing to luggage and to the grounds and even an entertainment committee, are all lined up to see them. And this is why Bhutto in her commentary says, what kind of way to start a film is that? To show that there's few English living like gods, and all the Indians are servants. And we focus in on the servants then. In fact, that's the story. The story really is, well, there's two parts to the story. There's the story of Mountbatten and his wife, Edwina. And she's a fiery type, right? And we'll see more about her. And the other story is this guy, Jeet, the younger of these two, who's like a valet to the Viceroy, helps him dress, and is his personal dresser. And in the personal story of Jeet, this is the guy who's come to work, new to the working in the palace. Like they're having lunch here in this scene, and you see the guy, the servant again, cutting the grass blade by blade, like whether that really happened or not. Surely they just got goats to do. It probably did happen. I want to show when Edwina is walking along, inspecting the new, the servants in the kitchen. She meets them to say, things are going to be a bit different around here. I'm in control. And then Alia, who's in the schooling and education committee, helps Edwina go around and do first lady type stuff. right? And that's the story, and why Bhutto is concerned that Gurinder Chaddha's told this story through the perspective of the servants is because if you're going to tell the story of the independence movement, you're framing them within a perspective that's already one of that's emphasizing how, well, there's a myth going around that the Indian, not going around, there's a presentation of the story as if the British were loved and respected, and really the independence movement was about fighting to get rid of them, right? So while both sides are true, there were certainly some that did work in the Viceroy's house and probably even loved their employers, to whatever love would mean there. But there's also a massive and maybe even bigger story in the opposition to the British, that, you know, for 30 years, Gandhi had fought in various ways, or some people will criticize that, to get rid of the British using whatever means. And here they are in the garden having their garden parties. And it's basically Edwina and some of the committee having tea and listening to a gramophone with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 servants. Right? So excessive, sumptuous, and yes, servile. Now, here's the thing about Orientalism that's interesting. Maybe this did happen, right? Maybe there was a moment where this really happened. But in telling the story, by putting this in the story, you make the Orient seem like this is what it was like always, or for all. Now, this is certainly what it was probably. Certainly what it was probably, you can't even say that. It was probably, and more than likely, certainly the case that there was this sort of thing going on all the time with the British, some of the British. But many other British were not like that. And the situation was not like that for everyone. So what you focus on, what you emphasize, shapes the interpretation. And this is going out all over the world, right? This is a film by a very respected director telling the story. And the thing is, then questions have to be asked about its perspective. Right. Now, what do we know about her perspective? She was, because she's successful, Gurinder Chaddha was able to film in the presidential house, right? A British director comes in and makes a film in the sumptuous garden, which is the presidential house now, was the Viceroy's house. That's something that you could film those interiors, and, well, given the architecture, maybe we should see that. But how we see it is not loving pictures of the architecture, it's kind of adoring pictures of the administration within that architecture. And of course, they're watching the news events of the day, and there are riots going on in anticipation of the partition and the departure of the British, and they're losing control politically, right? And here they are worrying about that in their sumptuous drawing rooms, and the generals are trying to just get out, basically. There's actually a conspiracy going on that Chaddha is focused on, and that's that the generals wanted to get out as quickly as possible and find someone to blame if it went wrong, which it would probably go wrong. And Dickey, Mountbatten, who's considered able to charm anyone, is the one who's going to get the blame, right? And Churchill and all the others. Again, there's servants. You see this guy saying no to a drink. And all the regal splendor is lovingly portrayed. And that's a question. But the other perspective from the film is this classic servants level story, right? This is a Bollywood trope even. Remember, she made Pride and Prejudice as well. the perspective of the servants and the whole film framed through their eyes as they, well, the narrative is them falling in love, or they've already been in love and they're getting back together, and their love is now forbidden because the division of India is being divided by the British on religious lines, and Alia is Muslim and Jeet is Hindu. He's a Hindu who dresses in slightly, well, more Muslim way than not, but I guess that's his outfit for work, I'm not sure. And he's previously been working as a messenger to send messages to her father as part of the independence movement. So it's not like that's how they met. But of course, there's conflict. Someone saying, you can't, you've got to stick to your own kind. You can't dance across the borders, right? This is not at Parliament House now. This is at the outside the house of Alia's father, who's played by Om Puri, the great actor, in one of his last roles. And this is the great Indian Bollywood actor, Om Puri. This is, again, Gurinder Chaddha's power. She could get that actor to agree to do a film. And she's got power. Anyway, the conspiracy behind the scenes is going on. And, of course, people are starting to move from Pakistan to India, from India to Pakistan. And honestly, that's a huge trauma of the story. In fact, let's get into that by going back to the PowerPoint, because the story of Partition of India, we need to follow that. How to do that. So I can't just change presenting from a clip to a, it's not smooth, is it? So back to my PowerPoint. So at midnight on August the 15th, 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru, who became the first Prime Minister of India, said, "As the world sleeps, India awakens to freedom. Clock hands join at midnight," right? And this is the salutation, the greeting that you'll get from Hindus or Bengalis, and namaskar, namaste in Hindi. Clock hands joined at 12, so at 12 o'clock in the midnight hour, as the world sleeps. Of course, when it's midnight in India, the world isn't sleeping. Much of the world is awake. But anyway, by the by, never let good rhetoric, the truth get in the way of good rhetoric. India gets independence, but that's what the politicians are saying. But Nehru is very concerned, and Gandhi even more concerned, that what the British have done by drawing up an agreement, and this is the film is the story of this agreement, between the Muslim League and the Hindu-dominated Congress, what's left of the Congress after the Muslims have moved out of Congress, the political party of Gandhi, conceding to the Muslim League's demand that there be an independent Islamic Muslim state, right? A Muslim state, not Islamic, a Muslim state, where followers of Islam where the majority areas of Muslims will make one country, and then the other areas where the majority is Hindu or other Indian faiths, of which there are many, will be India. And Gandhi was opposed to that viciously. Jinnah conceded to that. Nehru conceded to that. Jinnah wanted that. Jinnah was the leader of the Muslims, although he was not himself a devout Muslim. He was, he liked to drink, and by the by, he was certainly politically for them. And the British set out to just divide the country, and they drew what's called the Radcliffe Line. A man called Radcliffe was assigned the job of drawing on the map where the partition would be. This would be Pakistan, and this would be India. Now, how did they do it? They did it bureaucratically, Islam and Hinduism. So we can look at the areas that have a high percentage of Hindu from the 1909, so 40 years earlier, census, right? The percentage of Hindus in the country, this is the India shape, right? And you see the darker the red, the more higher percentage of Hindus. So they're all over. And then the same year, the percentage of areas where there's many Muslims. And you see there are two areas of dark green, green being the color of Islam, here and here. And these become the areas that will be called Pakistan. And they're separated by this huge area where there are many Muslims who live. In fact, there are more Muslims living in India than anywhere else in still what is called India today. Except for even maybe only Indonesia rivals them. But Pakistan becomes this green area on the right and the green area on the left, which is places like East Bengal, Sikkim, Meghalaya, some of the hill states, Chittagong. So right, we're looking at, and you see the third map here is a different collection of religions. Sikhs, the darker color, Buddhists, the yellow. As you see, there's a lot in Burma. Burma was a part of India under British India. And Jains, and they're the orange color. Right? Jains and others. The Jains are quite a large religion, but maybe less than 1% of all of India. Right? I mean, the empire is big and the British control most of it, but not all. We've got to show that, the parts of India were independent state kingdoms run by Rajas, Indian kings. Many of them managed now by the British, but many of them are still independent. Having fought wars against the British and then compromised. None held out, all were eventually defeated. Tipu Sultan, probably one of the last to hold out so long. But places like Hyderabad, they had a Nawab who was in charge of that princely state, they're called. And then Rajputania, Mysore, and then lots of smaller ones. All over India, really. Small state. Adding up to, if you look at the pink bits are the British controlled. So explicitly controlled, the British India. And then the yellow bits are separate states or countries. And while those states are controlled by, they have like a collector or overseer from British, they largely have their own economy. Gwalior, other places like that, have their own economy, their own exchequer, and are relatively separate and relatively rich because the British haven't been ripping wealth out of there as much. Right? And then what becomes Pakistan is more explicit in this map. You see the green area becomes East Pakistan, and the green area on the other side is Pakistan, West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan, and East Pakistan in 1971 later fights an independence war and becomes Bangladesh. Still a separate country. which runs down into down here, Chittagong. Basically, is almost Burma, Myanmar. But, okay, so there's going to be these two parts of Pakistan and one big India. And there are, as we saw from this map, there are Muslims all over the country. There are Hindus all over the country. And then there are Sikhs in places that are going to be split right down the middle, actually. The Punjab is the breadbasket of India, a very fertile land, and it's going to be split down the middle by this Radcliffe line. And so thousands of people move. And they move in huge, full trains and walking, carrying all their belongings on carts, and the biggest movement of people, millions of people. Up to that time, there's never been maybe the slave trade was the biggest other shift of people from one place to another. Millions of Africans being dragged to the Americas. This one, though, going in two directions. And the story is horrific. And there are many stories about it. The partition is one that comes with tragic stories, with some families torn from their birthplace, right? Taking all their belongings, everything they had, they've got nowhere to go. They've lost their house, locking it up and seeing or seeing it as soon as they left being taken by the other religion that now feels hostile to them, and then trekking through lands where there were people that sometimes attacked them, and sometimes the convoys of people, Hindus going this way, Muslims going this way, then just shouted at each other some insults, and then suddenly launched at each other, killing each other in some kind of crazed hostility that was based on just the British egging each side on. And the Sikhs caught in between. The Sikhs are having to fight either side. And so many stories. Stories, for example, I have a friend who does research on this, and she told the story of having interviewed one man several times who was on one of these trains that got attacked by the other side, and everyone in the train was slaughtered, and he only survived because he hid under the seat behind his mother's sari, right, which was hanging down. And the train, basically, everyone was killed with machetes, and there was inches of blood at the bottom of the train. And he experienced this and survived and was telling the tale. Only after she had interviewed him several times did she realize suddenly that actually he was too young to have been there. He wasn't that old that he would have been there. And in fact, he was telling his father's story that he had kind of inherited, and he, as a memory that he believed. So there's these classic stories about this partition, and everyone who lived it was traumatized, and everyone subsequently kind of knows about this. So then in comes Gurinder Chaddha, right? She's a British Hindu, diasporic Asian living in Britain. And she picks up the story of two Frenchmen, Lapierre and Collins, who wrote a book about the partition. And she tells that story. And Lapierre and Collins, they had made a book called City of Joy about Calcutta. And then they wrote this book, Freedom of Midnight, traveling around India in a Rolls Royce, interviewing people for the story, staying at various palatial, they were considered guests by many of the princely state nawabs and leaders. And they were also visiting some of the still extant French colonies in India, and were famous for writing City of Joy. And these books like that are they came later, but they were right into exoticism in a big way, and praise for Mountbatten. They wrote very favorably about Mountbatten and that his effort to calm the waters, so to speak. But and maybe it's even true that Mountbatten was okay, but he is the representative of the British royal family. Right? Anyway, it's pulp history, and they present the dominant framing of the story of partition, right? Which is that there was this huge conflict. And in the film, it's represented in this Orientalist, exoticist way, right? Through the perspective of Arya and Jeet, and of course, what Gurinder Chaddha's learned from Bollywood is how to make a good love story. So. What happens is that Arya is put on a train by her father to save her and shipped out of Delhi, but the train is attacked, because everyone knows the story of the train got attacked, but she's injured, kind of loses her memory or something, and survives, and is taken back to Delhi, of all places, and is in a hospital camp, and Jeet is hunting everywhere for her, and miracle of miracles, almost doesn't find her, but does, calling out her name, and finds her, and they're reunited. And we see Edwina and Mountbatten going through the medical camp, the refugee camp, handing out condolences, and everything is kind of, people went crazy for a while, but it's going to be okay. But the representation of Gandhi, the great leader in the film, is that he, likes goat's milk and is a vegetarian, and we don't hear much more from him. The representation of Jinnah, the Muslim leader, is this kind of demonic Pakistan figure. In fact, anytime we see in the film any Pakistanis, they're starting a fight, which is pretty extreme bias, let's say, from the Hindu perspective. And then the story about Nehru is kind of dubious as well, because Nehru is presented as being a bit too friendly with Edwina Mountbatten. There's another love story going on, and that's rumor and has existed, and I mean it's always existed. In fact, the previous great big film about partition was Richard Attenborough's Gandhi film. And in that, there were some people who said, you can't make a film about Gandhi. You can't have an actor like Ben Kingsley, who was British Asian, playing Gandhi, because Gandhi should be shown as a ball of white light crossing the screen. His beyond human representation, which is insane, but because Gandhi had flaws and so on. But anyway, it was a very successful film. But on the Muslim side, they said, well, why has Gandhi got a film? Why hasn't Jinnah got a film? And they were raising money. When I was in England, when I was first there as a researcher, I got invited, didn't have to pay, to a £1,000 per head dinner, right? I don't think most people at that paid £1,000, but some people would have, to raise money to make a film on Jinnah that would be as great as the film on Gandhi, because they were leaders of the movement on both sides. And they were talking about who they would get to play Jinnah. And the most fantastic moment arose when there was a serious suggestion that Ben Kingsley be asked to play Jinnah, as well as having played already Gandhi, so the same guy. But they ended up getting Vincent Price to play Jinnah, which is slightly unfortunate because Vincent Price's other famous role is as Dracula. And there is a little bit of Count Dracula around this Jinnah in this film as well. And he doesn't come across as a good guy, right? He's demonized in a way that would be Orientalism in some people's eyes. So if we go back to the film, we will see Jinnah into the preview. We'll see Jinnah as this character. So we go from the tab. It's just after here. It's not him. This is the Exodus, right? People hopelessly trying to get support from whoever they can. And yes, the royal Mountbatten and Edwina are wandering around on horses trying to help people in the grounds of the presidential palace, as if that would. Anyway, so this is Nehru. He is looking quite severe. And this guy with his back to us at present is Jinnah. And they are presented as if they were enemies, right? And no doubt in some ways they were. This is Gandhi, of course. And Gandhi is his other figure, but they make him out to be an eccentric in the film. Maybe he was getting a bit older by that stage. Now, where's the bit of Jinnah? Witness the end of the empire, right? As if through a love story, right? Witness the end of the empire through the perspective of the servants in a forbidden love. It's like almost a cliche, but yeah, it's wonderful, and they make a good couple. And there are so many films where that kind of thing happens, right? And they have their happy moment, and two nations are born. I'm not getting Jinnah. But here's Gandhi, the one point where he actually gets angry about the partition, and he was very vocal critic of partition. This is a section from the romance of Edwina and Jawaharlal Nehru. But now there's still whenever there's violence, it's created by the Muslims. Right here, the Muslims have rioted to destroy their own homes in that part of the film. Or it's provocation by the Hindus against something the Muslims have done. I can't find the picture of Jinnah that I wanted, because they really make him out to be a bad guy. Maybe I can do it a different way. Yeah, I can't really. So if we look at this tab, you'll see here is Jinnah represented in the Parliamentary House with Mountbatten looking at the plans. And it's made out that they've had a separate secret meeting to agree. But if we look at the historical photographs, there's a real one of Jinnah meeting with Gandhi in the grounds of the house with where else have we got Jinnah? Here's Jinnah again, real Jinnah this time. This is the meeting of Gandhi and Mountbatten in Parliament House. We don't get much more. So, real Jinnah in an article called "Demolish Jinnah House to Build a Freedom Fighters Memorial" from the Shiv Sena, which is a right-wing Indian group. A photo from Viceroy's house of what's supposed to be Jawaharlal Nehru and Edwina Mountbatten. Here's the photograph I was looking for. So this is Jinnah. Let me try and make it bigger. Can't really. This is Jinnah in the film, and they make him very severe looking. A bit scary. Okay, maybe he was a bit scary in real life. Smoking cigarettes like every good Muslim should, and so on and so forth. Here, yeah. So the accusation against this is Jinnah, like looking more like a normal figure, right? And that's the Viceroy there, not as fat. Gandhi meeting the Viceroy. So yeah, the film is representative of, well, it's not the only one that makes mileage out of partition for interpretation that continues the battle between Muslims and Hindus, refights the partition over and over again. There are many other such films. And there's a phenomenon, the use of Freedom of Midnight, and then the use of some other research that reveals the true story of the secret plan by the British to betray India is also a part of Gurinder Chaddha's version of the story. We should get into it. But today there's a series of films that belong to a new genre that seems to emerge of nostalgia for the Raj films, or Raj nostalgia film. It's existed for a while. Merchant Ivory, films like Heat and Dust, Jewel in the Crown did that in the 80s. But there's been a new return in television serials, like and they have unlike Gurinder Chaddha's Viceroy's House, they have a real millennial cool about them. Taboo is with Stephen Knight and Christopher Hardy. It's the story of a guy who's got, like, from the servant's perspective, he's mixed race and he's got lots of tattoos. He looks like the coolest of contemporary post-anarchist millennial youth, right? And yet the whole story is still Raj nostalgia, because it goes back to retell the story of colonialism as a kind of adventure of people with good intentions trying to do their best against a few villains that ran the East India Company, rather than a systematic colonial project. So here's part of the framing of Orientalism. The violence is done by a few on the side of the East India Company, but all Muslims are violent, right? And now the violence is, at the same time, brought from Europe, crushes the romantic ideal of Asia, where everything was exotic and beautiful. So there's this double play, and you can't have it both ways. And of course now, the Indian government trade on this too, right? They are presenting the civilization of India as this idyllic time with no Muslims at all, for their own gain. The saffron-clad Prime Minister of India, Modi, who is the self-orientalizing type. So Gurinder Chaddha, she is bought into this. And this is a shame, because Baji on the Beach and Bend It Like Beckham, even Bride and Prejudice were pretty great films. And British Butt, her best one, was a student film. What to do about the actual house that she gets to shoot in? Part of the film shot in these lavish interiors, right? We saw that. The opulence. Not to forget that this opulence is the wealth of Asia stolen by the British to fund the Industrial Revolution, basically. Collected at Palace Castle and the British Museum, all this booty stolen out of India in the 1700s and 1800s. Only a little was left in the Parliament House, but still it's lush, but so much more wealth was ripped out. So the Viceroy's final stages is only a fraction of the tale. And to see it as this heroic attempt to leave fairly really needs to be put in frame of a wider story. And it's almost an insult to tell this political story through the fake love story of the two servants, or the even more fake love story of Edwina and Nehru. Alia and Jeet, we can suspend criticism, because it's a fiction, right? Although it's a historical fiction, it's a true tale, right? Partition really did happen. And there's huge amounts of scholarship on partition. Urvashi Bhutalia, Gayendra Pandey, you can go and read, you can visit the memorials in the Red Fort, the Victoria Memorial, Raj Bhavan. I mean, there didn't used to be so many memorials, but now you can see, and there's no question the memorial, the museums that commemorate partition are also interpreting, right, from different perspectives. But there are huge numbers of examples of a much more nuanced story than the one produced by Viceroy's House and its pantomime love story in the kitchen. Right? So many other versions of partition films, right? I want to mention, just in case you ever want to chase them up, Ritvik Ghatak, a Bengali filmmaker, he made a trilogy, Megha Dakatara, Kamal Ganda, and Subranareka. Attenborough's Gandhi, of course, with Ben Kingsley, and Jinnah, mentioned with Christopher Lee. The Mela film we looked at last week with Nargis and Dilip Kumar. In Pinjar in 2003, there was some kidnapped women crossed the border, and that was another issue, a big issue that was a little bit, tragic, because it really happened on occasion, many occasions, in fact, that women were kidnapped or found abandoned in the wrong part and integrated into families of which they were not members, like the Muslim, exactly what happened in Mela. If you've watched that now, the Nargis character is married into a Hindu family. Nargis is required to become the mother of the children of India, right? And so also were some Indian mothers made into the custodians of families where the male had been killed in Pakistan, and vice versa. And there was a film about that, Pinjar. More interesting, maybe in 2015 to 2017, there was two films, Began Jan, this one, this one is the other one, Raj Kahini. And directed by the same person, but one a Bangla one a Hindi one. So in different languages and slightly different emphases on each. And then the gimmick was, which one is best? Of course, that's a great publicity stunt. I don't know how successful it was as a stunt, but I don't think I'll have time to go through the stereotypes in Nehru House, but the representation of Nehru is dodgy. He's from Cambridge and educated. Gandhi is a half-naked fakir. All the English are cynical, avuncular. Mountbatten could charm a vulture off a corpse. Great one-liners, but Edwina is righting wrongs, and all the British tops are playing politics over tragedy. And there's a long tradition in Indian film of not succumbing to these kind of stereotypes, of avoiding them. But I want to say, in this Raj nostalgia film context that's coming up, South Asian cinema, repeating the Merchant Ivory films and late night British TV, and even films like Wild West, My Beautiful Laundrette, Hidden Dust, reruns, although some of the better films are not shown. The ones I just mentioned, they're shown. Hidden Dust is shown, but not Ritwik Gadak. East is East, but not Wild West. There's a version of the Raj that's being repeated over and over that serves a certain interpretation. This is the grunge version of Taboo, right? There's this guy with the tats and so on, and the bad English East India company, the bad apple among the many, right? And it's simply not the. Anyway, I'm starting to waffle and really should stop for a bit of a break. Let's have some discussion, question time, or chat. There is in the. I see some people have accessed it already in the announcements page of the e-learning material. There's a question and a space for discussion that's already been checked by some. So please, now let's go to that, and here it is, right? And 50 responses already, which is great. And we'll be able to have a discussion. So we'll stop for a break and then get into discussion. And then I want to talk about what the assessment will be more and really start to nut that out. So it's going to have to be conversation. Let's take 5 minutes for a cup of tea. So we'll come back at 14:15, right? 5 minutes from now, and begin again. Thank you. All right, sorry, I'm back. And anyone has any questions or comments to make? I'm just reading through the answers. They all seem a bit samey, but especially these are the ones I'm reading that were before the discussion. Long, very good. It does have metaphorical meanings. That's really important part of it. Actually, it's a contested and demarcated zone of interpretation. And I don't think there's a right version now. It's so buried in competition between the different sides. And honestly, if Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru and all those people couldn't work it out, who are we? All right, so the kind of question I ask has got to be done carefully, I suppose. Good job. Try. Is there a number missing here? Took the 7th century? 1300 years ago? No. I think that's a typo, right? I mean, there was fragmentation in the 7th century. Buddhism was ending and Hinduism was becoming. I mean, it took 300 years for Buddhism to really end, and it moved to China and to Japan, Vietnam. All right, I can't answer all or comment on all, but yeah, thank you for doing that. It gives me a record of who's been here. Of course, I'm also using a screenshot. Okay, some of it's pretty funny. All right, I guess we've got a bit over. bit under an hour left, but I could go on and on about partition because there's so much more. But maybe just instead of that, I want to talk about the assessment. Yeah, whether or not you've got any views on the assessment or what you think about my view. And I say my view because I want to present this and open for negotiation, what I think should happen. You already had some of your experience of doing a zine in my class, I think. Some at least, probably all. I'm not sure. So 70, I just can't get my head around the numbers. It's quite large. So I'm offering this as a possible assessment for this course. Right, we've got to do a midterm and a final in December. Right, well, it's going to be early January, really. Although I don't want it to be because I want my year, you know, Christmas is Christmas. New Year's Eve is New Year. Anyway, because of we started late, we're going to end late. But midterm is coming up November 4th. So something has to come in by then, and then something for final. And what I'm suggesting is that we take up topics and find ways to use interpretive strategies and what I call doubles, dialectic, two sides to every story, right? And use that as the strategy for entering into what I talked about last week a little bit, an audit. I should be recording this, shouldn't I? Forgive me for forgetting. So I have to repeat that.